Welcome everyone to the final talk in this series of New Voices on Du Châtelet for the summer and I guess early fall of 2022. So this talk will be by Marcy Lascano, who's a professor at the University of Kansas, and I think is also the first person who first informed me about Du Châtelet's existence in philosophy a long time ago. So it's nice to have her on the series. She'll be talking about Du Châtelet and the powers of minds and bodies.
Hi. Thank you, Aaron. And I want to thank Clara and Jill as well for organizing all this. And I know it's the last talk. And so, yay, thank you. It's been really great to hear everybody's work and to learn from it. I learned quite a bit listening to some of the other talks. That said, so this talk is obviously about Du Châtelet on the powers of minds and bodies. I have written before on powers on Cavendish, and this is for a edited volume, this piece. And I thought, oh, well, you know, that'll be a pretty easy thing to do. And it turns out it's not, because it really does get us into some sticky issues between, I think, about the relationships between minds and bodies and what bodies are and all of these issues, which I'm a little less conversant with. And so I am leaning a bit on, quite a bit on Catherine Brading and other people who have worked on this before. So what I want to talk about today then is what a power is for Du Châtelet. I think that part, what a power is and how it's exemplified, is fairly clear in Du Châtelet, but it gets a little trickier once we start talking about how powers are exemplified in bodies and in minds, and of course in the simple beings that constitute maybe some of those. And then I'll switch to talking about the power of self-motion in bodies, and I will give a sort of a reading of on liberty, which Aaron probably won't like, which is a compatibilist reading, and one where I want to argue that some of the sort of peculiarities in the language in Du Châtelet's piece is because I think that she's following Locke, and Locke sometimes sounds like a compatibilist and sometimes sounds like somebody who is not a compatibilist. And this is a fairly common thing for people to take in one way or the other, right? So I want to say that that's going to give us some explanatory hold, but it's also unclear how her views on liberty connect to the ones from the foundations. Okay. So start with the easy part. What is a power? So Du Châtelet lays out her views on powers in Foundations 126, section 126. And she says, the simple power or faculty to act is only a possibility of action or passion in beings. In this way, it's said that an animal has the ability to walk, a bow to drive an arrow, a watch to mark the hours, because one can explain by the structure of the animal, the bow, and the watch, how and why these effects are possible, right? So here she's saying that a power, you know, has to be something that can, something that comes from the structure of a being, right? So we need to look a little bit at Du Châtelet's views on how beings are structured. So according to Du Châtelet, I think the structure of a being includes its essential properties, which follow from the essence of that being. And in addition, they have variable properties, or modes, as we would say, whose possibility, she says, finds its sufficient reason in the essence, but their actuality depends either on the antecedent modes or on exterior beings, or on both at the same time, right? So while each being is going to have an essence, each kind of thing will have an essence, that its properties that are stable, right? It's, you know, we might say attributes in some sense, are stable. In in addition to that, we also have the modes, which can change, but modes are brought not directly from the essence, and so they are able to come into existence and go out of existence. So, according to du Châtelet, a power is a result of a being's essential properties or possible variable modes, which are brought into existence either by previous modes or external agents. Okay. So actualizing powers. So this part is going to go easily, and then I'm going to flounder all over the place. So I look forward to some help. Actualizing powers, according to du Châtelet, well, she thinks that these powers have to have some sufficient reason for their actuality. So it's not the case that we can just, have, well, there is always a cause for them, is the right way to say that. For the actuality of any action, she says, is called a force. For the simple power or ability to act is only a possibility of action or of a passion in beings, which requires a sufficient reason for its actuality. So du Châtelet claims that if the power to act did not require a sufficient reason for its exemplification, then the animal would always walk, or the clock would always mark the hour, etc. So it would just be continual. It would be something that was always exemplified. But since we don't see that powers are continually exemplified, we know that there has to be some sufficient reason for bringing something from possibility into actuality. And she calls this a force. She says it's a force that sets to work this power that a being has to act, right? And so, as we saw before, this could be something that follows from their primary and invariable properties, or from the modes, from prior modes or external bodies acting on other bodies. So the view of how powers are actualized comes into play, of course, in her views on collision and things like that. But I'm going to sort of like bracket that right now, because I just want to talk about motion in general. Okay, so what has powers? Okay, so this is where it starts to get, I think, a little tricky. So du Châtelet gives us some information about how we should think about the simple beings, which she thinks are the real beings, the real substances, of course, in her philosophical system. She says they're the simple beings from which compound beings result, cannot but endure. They're the real substances. They're durable. They're susceptible to modifications, which their internal force produces. They're active. They carry in them the principle of their change, that is to say, force, and which to them is essential and can never leave them and cannot cease. Later she says each monad or simple being contains a sequence of changes that's different from the other sequence of changes in other simple beings. And here she's saying that we can differentiate simple beings based on the sequence of changes in them. Likewise, we can differentiate souls based on the different sequence of ideas that they have. So here, as most of you are familiar with, as most of you are familiar with the claim that the simple beings for du Châtelet are the fundamental entities, and then somehow we get bodies due to a kind of the arrangement of the simples, right, and the way they rearrange themselves. So here, the idea that the simples are somehow in some kind of contact or arrangement with one another seems to be a sort of Wolffian idea. I think Brading talks about this quite a bit in her book. This kind of differentiating her from Leibniz, who doesn't think that the simples interact in any way. But du Châtelet seems to be committed to that idea. So for du Châtelet, bodies at least appear to have powers as well, right? But these, the power that a body has to be borrowed from the simples. So obviously bodies are mere phenomena for du Châtelet. And she says their essence includes extension, active or motive force, and passive or resisting force. So we need to have force in order to completely explain the movement of bodies and how they affect one another. One of the things that I found a little troubling in du Châtelet, and so here I'm gonna put this out there, and hopefully somebody can correct me or help me, enlighten me, is this claim that there's no matter without force or force without matter. If the active force is at play not just in bodies, but also in souls, I wonder why she makes this claim. There cannot be any matter without motive force, nor motive force without matter. That would lead one to think that minds are material, right? I mean, and it doesn't seem to me that that's her view, although I'm not completely sure. Certainly, bodies have this borrowed sort of force in them. Again, du Châtelet doesn't explain how that works, how the simples are manifest this into or manifest bodies, but with respect to souls or minds, here it seems sort of complicated how the force would be without matter. So one of the questions I have is she really committed to the idea that minds are immaterial? I mean, she certainly does say that at points, right, that they're immaterial. But it seems to me also that a lot of people put a lot of pressure on the discussion of Locke, and how she says that philosophers say that matter might think, right? That dispute from the essay where she says philosophers say that matter might think, even though they say that the nature of body is simply extension and solidity. And she says, but if those are the attributes of bodies, then they can't think. But she doesn't say that she doesn't think that, that she doesn't hold that view herself necessarily, right? That extension and solidity are the only attributes of body. Certainly force is in there. So I'm a little bit perplexed about that claim. So that's just one of the things that I'm trying to work out. So also whether souls or minds should be identified with some or all of the simple beings. So if she is taking the Wolffian line, as he was agnostic about whether all simples or monads were minded or not, she might as well. She might hold that some simple beings are minds, while others are not. But it's somewhat unclear here. Like I said, one might be tempted to claim that since there's no active force without matter, that minds are material. But again, she does seem to hold that thought is not in the essence of matter. So this leaves me perplexed with respect to that claim. In the Institutions, Chapter 2, she does seem to commit herself to 3 types of entities. It looks like she's saying that, God creates the world, and this is in the argument for the existence of God in Chapter 2. And she says that being that creates the world is different from the matter which the world consists in, or from the elements, and from our souls. So that looks like she's got 3 different entities, at least at the basic level. So du Châtelet also talks about various powers in minds. She talks about the powers of judgment, the powers of understanding, the power of willing, abstraction. These are ones that she mentions in Foundations and also in On Liberty. So we know that she thinks that minds have their own powers. Um, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the self-motion of bodies. So the self-moving forces here, du Châtelet is committed to a mechanical account of the natural world. And while force provides bodies with the power to act, these changes occur due to the way that the simples are arranged or ordered. And this results, of course, in the rearrangement of the parts and bodies that we experience. Like I said before, she doesn't tell us how that works, but she does seem to be committed to a mechanical account throughout the foundations, so that collisions are going to be important. And in addition to that, she seems to be committed to a certain amount of determinism. So Brading notes this passage that's the second bullet point on the slide, where we talk about the states of elements, so which is another term she uses for simple beings. Here, the states of the elements, she says, are such that they have to have a relation to the future states and the present state, and to the past, and that all these states will follow from one another. So when one element is changed, the other elements have to agree in sort of harmony. Brading calls this a remarkable statement of a very strong form of determinism. It looks like causal determinism to me. And so here we say we've got, du Châtelet tends to talk about causal relations in the foundations when she's discussing the way bodies interact. And so here looks like a form of causal determinism. So, and Brading worries about this, I think, in du Châtelet's work, in that it looks like that's going to block off some of the views on freedom that du Châtelet is concerned about. I think that the problem is actually worse than causal determinism, because once you bring God into the picture, it looks like you're going to get a kind of metaphysical determinism. And the statement here at Foundations of Physics 129, I think, is a stronger version. And so here she says the different states of a simple depend on one another. So this is not between the simples, but within a simple, right? So within a simple here, they depend on one another for such a successive state being no more necessary than another. There must be a sufficient reason why such a state is actual, and why rather in such a time than any other. Now, this reason can only be found in the preceding state, and the reason for that will be in the state antecedent to it, and so on back to the first. This first state, which supposes no other antecedent to it, depended on God, but all subsequent states are linked, so that from the first follows the last, which was contained in it, and which must be such, because the first was so and not otherwise. In the same way, the actual state of a clock depends on the preceding state. So here, using a mechanical analogy, and on another, and so on back to the first, which depended on the way in which the craftsman arranged the wheels. So here, this seems to me like a very strong statement of metaphysical determinism. Here, it sounds more Leibnizian, right? I think it sounds more like Leibniz than, and I know that du Châtelet wants to say that God's only morally necessitated to create the world that he does. But I think Leibniz says something similar in the Theodicy. We've got a kind of still a worry about a very kind of strong version of determinism. Okay, so one of the things that I think follows from this is that certain views about freedom are not going to be open to du Châtelet. and this is, here's some wild speculation. Maybe she left this, the chapter on liberty out of the Foundations because she thought that it wasn't fitting at that point, or that she didn't think that it worked well with some of the things that she says with respect to the physics. It's of course possible that she thinks that minds are such that they have a kind of freedom that bodies don't. But again, we are embodied beings in some sense, right? We have, at least we are phenomenally have bodies that are acting according to mechanical principles. So it makes it harder to maintain the claim that Du Châtelet wants to claim, that we can think and not think, or do and not do. I think that's harder to reconcile with some of these views. So I want to talk a little bit about something about the views on liberty. So I kind of have an outline here of what I see are the major breakdowns in of the text here. It's a short text, right? So Du Châtelet begins by saying that the topic of freedom is worthy of a digression here. I think that's interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that clearly she is worried about freedom, and I think with good cause. The more that she's invested in certain views in physics, the more troublesome freedom's going to look. In addition, I should mention that Locke does something very similar at the very end of Power. He apologizes for this long, sort of, in his case, definitely long digression about liberty, and says that it's such an important topic that he felt like he had to talk about it. Du Châtelet then defines liberty after she says this. I'm going to show in a second that I think that her definition is very, very close to the the French translation of Locke's essay. She then considers the inner feeling of liberty. That's the way Locke starts of Power. He starts talking about through sensation and reflection, we have these ideas that we can move our bodies and we can think certain thoughts and other thoughts. She then lays out arguments against the Lockean view of liberty. I'm going to show you some text here in just a second, where you can see that the argument against liberty is based on things that Locke says in the essay. So it looks like, okay, she's got a critique, or she's imagining a critique of the kind of freedom that she's going to accept. And then she provides these Lockean replies. And then in the last section of this, she turns to talking about God's freedom and discusses moral necessity versus absolute necessity. So I think bullet point 6 is the only part that is not Lockean, obviously. I know that Girardi has claimed that this discussion of moral versus absolute necessity can't be Leibnizian, that it must be Clarke, because Leibniz doesn't accept degrees of freedom. I think that Du Châtelet doesn't accept degrees of freedom either. So here, disagreeing a little bit with Girardi and with my former self, by the way, I should also say, because I've claimed that she had that in the past. And I think I agree with Aaron that she does not hold that there are degrees of freedom. It's a way of talking, and admittedly, I found it in Locke as well. So I do think that that's not true. So let's start with the definition. And here I put the French, sorry. Du Châtelet says that she calls freedom the power to think a thing or to not think it, to move or to not move in conformity with the choice of one's mind. Locke says, or Cost writes something similar. Locke puts it a slightly different way in the essay when he says, insofar as a man has the power to think or not think, to move or not move, in conformity with the preference of his choice in that that so far is he free, right? So, but note the strong similarities in the definitions here. So I think that this is something that's pretty clearly close. Why does it look like Clark? So I mean, both Aaron and Julia Girardi think that that her views on freedom come from Clark, and I think that Clark, of course, is influenced by Locke to some degree. Of course, he wants to take Locke in the more libertarian spirit. And Locke was read by other philosophers in this way. There's an amusing correspondence with von Limborch, who was an Armenian and who had written Locke. I think Julie Walsh has a nice piece about this in The Lockean Mind, that recent volume on Locke's views, where von Limborch wrote, who's an Armenian and believed in libertarian free will, wrote Locke and said, it's great that we share this view on freedom. We're both libertarians, right? And Locke was, he said, no, I'm not. And he went back into the essay and tried to make it clearer that he is a compatibilist. But the language that he uses sometimes, I think, really is somewhat misleading. So, so quickly, I will just show some of the passages. So Du Châtelet, after talking about the definition and our inner self, inner sense of freedom, goes on to give these objections to liberty, which you see on the slide here. So Du Châtelet's on the one side and Locke's on the other. You can see by the essay. So she starts by saying that, we cannot doubt that there are emotions in the bodies that do not depend on our will, such as circulation of the blood and the beating of the heart, some other violent passions. Locke says something very similar. We have instances more than enough in our own bodies. A man's heart beats, blood circulates, which is not in his power or of any thought or volition to stop. Sometimes Locke writes boisterous, Cost translates it as violent. Passion hurries our thoughts, and so on and so forth. So here, a nice demonstration of how the objections include worries about Locke's philosophy and how this sort of compatibilism could be right. Further down in the text, Du Châtelet continues with the objection to liberty. She says, when two ideas present themselves to your understanding, as for example, the idea of going to bed and an idea of going out for a walk, it's absolutely necessary that you will one of the two things, or that you do not will either one. Here, on the other side is Locke. It's absolutely necessary that he will the one or the other. So again, talking about having a choice. And Locke does use the example of walking, explain that a man walking to whom it's proposed to give off walking is not at liberty, whether he will determine himself to walk or give off walking or no, he must necessarily prefer one to the other of them, walking or not walking. And so in regard of all other actions proposed, right? So here's worries about this kind of determinism in this. And then, I'm sorry, that's small. But so these are her replies to the argument. I think you can see the highlighting is supposed to indicate where the language, the thoughts, the views are very similar. So in the first reply to worries about the argument here, she says, when they say that we're not free regarding the act of willing itself, it does nothing to freedom because our freedom consists in acting or not acting, not willing or not willing. Locke here on the other side, liberty is not an idea belonging to volition or preferring, but to the person having the power of doing or forbearing to do according to the mind. So these are not, I mean, obviously it's not word for word quotations of Locke. She's using the view, and she doesn't seem to care about Locke's distinction between voluntary actions and free actions. She's only concerned with freedom. So she leaves that part of Locke out. But she does, the idea that that we turn will and understanding into little beings. Locke says the same thing. We're treating them as different little entities in our minds. She points out that perception and sensations are merely passive. Locke says the same thing in multiple places, and so I didn't put a quote there, but especially at the end of Power, Locke notes that perceptions and sensations, although they sound active, we say we have the power to think, that's also often a passive power, and the same with perception and sensation, of course. Here also the claim that that a libertarian type of freedom would favor the freedom of idiots and imbeciles, madmen and fools, as Locke says in the other passage, in his passage, very similar. Also, both of them claim that the power to think or not think, move or not move, is in no way touched by our having willed something already, right? So again, at 4 on the bottom, these two passages I think are very close. So here, when she says that the abstract notion of the will doesn't have any influence over the self-moving power, Locke says that there's a sort of indifferency in the operative power. That is, we're always able to use that power regardless of whether we have willed something or preferred something. And so this is a section where du Châtelet is providing objections to the argument that she has laid out. And then she goes on, there's more Locke. She says being determined. So here we've kind of moved into what it is that makes freedom full, that, as she says, right? The idea that freedom, it should be reason governed and that it's for happiness or perfection. Here, the passages I've lettered instead of numbered because just to make it clear, being determined by that which is the best to us is perfection, as large as the power of doing what we have judged. Locke says it's as much a perfection that desire or the power of preferring should be determined by good as the power of acting should be determined by the will. That one's very close. The power of suspending, I think most people agree that the faculty of suspension that du Châtelet talks about is from Locke. They both think that we have the power to suspend our judgment or preference, and that when we don't do that, we don't take the time to think and judge about our actions, that is when error and mistakes come in. That's passages B, or they're both in passages B. She also talks about how the type of freedom that we are talking about here is the type that higher beings and that God have. Locke makes the same point in the C passages here. You can see the comparison. Also that intelligent beings are necessitated to will and to judge. They both claim that, and that's the D passages. And finally, the E passages here are where she actually quotes Locke, right? So he is actually quoted in Of Liberty, where she says, we can hardly conceive of a being that has more freedom than the capacity of doing what pleases him. And as long as man possesses this freedom, he is as free as it is possible for freedom to make him, to borrow words from Mr. Locke. And then there's the passage that she's actually quoting on the other side. So I think the benefit of understanding the Locke here is twofold. One is that we can understand why du Châtelet looks like sometimes she's saying things that sound more libertarian on one hand, and then on the other hand sound quite compatibilist. It's because, well, Locke, as we all know, didn't want to revise the essay. He says himself that he was either too busy or too lazy to do so. And so the passages are not as clear as they could be. So that, I think the sense in which Locke is unclear, du Châtelet is following. And so it makes her seem somewhat unclear. And she's notoriously, usually very clear, I think. So this explains that kind of discrepancy. It also might mitigate somewhat the sense in which her views on the freedom of the mind are compatible with the freedom of the body. So if we think that bodies are determined, then in order to have some kind of freedom, it's going to have to be a compatibilist type of freedom. Okay, now I'll finish. I went too long. Thank you. Stop sharing.